Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. So, in this series, as you all know, we are studying Ustaz Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's book Meezan, which is his understanding of the contents of religion. We were studying one of the preambles of the book, which relates to fundamental principles. And amongst those principles, we were going through the principles of understanding the Quran. And these are 10 principles in all. So we have already covered some of these principles, which include linguistic principles, eloquence of language, classical Arabic. Uh, Similarly, that fact that the Quran has a final authority, that in the Quran, the way the content is spread out is like one part of the Quran explaining the other part. So some of these things that we have already touched upon, and these actually account for six of those principles. Today we'll be taking up the seventh principle, and that is actually titled as a chronicle of Muhammad's inzar. And this actually means that the subject matter of the Quran is that it is a narrative of a messenger's inzar. So inzar, of course, means warning, and warning about warning the people about the hereafter. So every page of the Quran speaks of this reality. And the reason for this is that the Quran has not merely been revealed as a compendium of Sharia and Hikmah. It has also been revealed to become the real means of the Prophet's warning to his people. And thus the Quran says, وَأُوحِيَ إِلَيَّ هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ لِأُنذِرَكُمْ بِهِ وَمَنْ بَلَغَ. And this Quran has been revealed to me that I may warn you through it and all those also whom it may reach. So the Prophet is the purpose of the Quran is to warn people, and the Quran, of course, through the Prophet will use the Quran to warn people, and wherever the Quran reaches, it will have the same purpose and objective as well. So, as far as the Quran is concerned, we know that Prophet Muhammad was not merely a Nabi or a prophet, he was also a Rasul, who's of course the equivalent of Rasul is messenger. So prophets are personalities whom the Almighty reveals divine guidance so that they can guide people. And not every prophet is a messenger, but every messenger obviously is a prophet, and a messenger is a higher cadre amongst prophets. So messenger is a position bestowed only to some of the prophets. And according to the details which are provided by the Quran, a Rasul or a messenger decides the fate of his immediate addressees who are present right in front of them, and he implements God's verdict on them in this very world. So the verdict of God, the judgment of God is implemented by the messenger in this very world. The Quran informs us that this final phase in the preaching endeavor of a Rasul comes after it passes through various phases. And these phases have been discussed separately when we were discussing the preaching Sharia. So these phases include Inzar, which means warning, then Inzar-e-Am, which means enhanced warning, and this actually reaches the third phase, which is the Itmamul Hujjah phase, in which communication is done or dissemination of the truth is done to the enemies or to all people in such a way that they are left with no excuse to deny the truth. And then we have Hijrat and Barat, which means that the Prophet would either migrate from his place, and he would also acquit himself from his enemies, which are of course his own people. And then now, of course, it will await the judgment of God. So it is in this phase that the divine court of justice is set up on this earth, and punishment is then given to the rejectors of the truth, and those who have accepted it are rewarded. And in this way, a miniature day of judgment, a lesser day of judgment is witnessed on the face of the earth. So we know that we will have a greater day of judgment. The greater day of judgment will be set up once this world is disbanded, and there will be a greater day of judgment. But in the life of every messenger of God, in the light of every messenger of God, this is something that is peculiar to it, something which is specific to it, that miniature days of judgment are set up in their own lives, in which the verdict of God is pronounced, so that these miniature days of judgment can then themselves become a substantiation of the greater day of judgment. So the history of the preaching missions of the messengers of God, which has been mentioned in the Quran, it shows that at this stage, which is the final stage, either of the two, there are two situations which can arise. When the time of the verdict comes, two situations can arise. One, a Rasul has a few companions, A messenger has a few companions, and there is no place available to him and his companions to migrate. Second, this is one of the situations. The other situation that is something that can possibly arise is that the messenger's companions are in substantial numbers, and the Almighty also furnishes a place to them where they can migrate and be bestowed with political authority. So, in both these situations, the established practice of the Almighty manifests itself. And this is a practice which the Quran has referred to in very, very explicit words. So, the words of the Quran are وَلِكُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولٌ فَإِذَا جَاءَ رَسُولُهُمْ قُضِيَ بَيْنَهُمْ بِالْقِسْطِ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. For each community there is a messenger. Then, when their messenger comes, their fate is decided with justice and they are not wronged. So, in the first situation, remember we said that the Rasul does not have a place to migrate and he has a very few companions. So, in this case, he is asked to leave his people, and this can be either through migration or because God calls that Rasul to himself, of course, giving him death. The verdict is delivered in such a way that divine punishment in the form of cyclones and storms, earthquakes, and other natural calamities descend upon these people who have rejected their respective messenger. And these calamities, they completely destroy them. However, this happens only when with those with whom the Quran, in its own terms, they are called mushrikun, which means that people who have deliberately accepted that polytheism is the real religion. As for those who are primarily monotheists, they could be deviant monotheists, but they are monotheists, they do not receive this punishment in which they are totally wiped out. For them, the rule is that instead of destroying them, they are subjected to the punishment of humiliation and subjugation. And it is known that this is what happened to the Israelites, while the people of Noah, Lot, Saleh, Shoaib, besides others, were totally wiped out. So we know as far as the Israelites are concerned, regarding them, the punishment of humiliation was ordained because, of course, they were primarily monotheists. But we know that the nations of Noah, Lot, Saleh, Shoaib, peace be upon them, all these messengers were totally routed and destroyed and wiped out from the face of the earth because they were totally involved in polytheism. And in this second situation, the law is the same as well. However, in this case, a Rasul and his companions subdue their nation by force. The second situation is one in which a Rasul or a messenger migrates from his nation to another place where they are given political authority. And in this case, the addressees of the Rasul are given, the new addressees, of course, to the place where they had migrated. The addressees which are found there, they are given some more respite. And this is the reason behind this is that Rasul actually delivers the truth to the people of this place where he had migrated. Again, to the extent that they are left with no excuse to deny it. And in technical terms, we know this is called Itmamul Hujjah, the completion of proof. Also, during this time, he instructs and purifies his followers and isolates them from his rejectors and organizes them to fight the enemy. So remember, in this case, the punishment does not come from natural disasters. It comes from the hands of the believers. In the first case, the Rasul is sifted out with his companions, which may be very few, and the natural disasters, they wipe out these nations like the nation of Lot and Noah and Shoaib, etc. But in the second case, in which a Rasul migrates to another place, in this case, the punishment which is given to people from whom he had migrated is given through the hands of the believers. So that is how when the Rasul goes to the place of migration, on the one hand, he is delivering the truth to the people who are living in that migrated place. And on the other hand, he is trying to organize his own people and instruct them in the way that they are able to fight the enemy who they had left behind in the earlier place. Of course, the place where they are going to migrate, they will also receive the same fate. A messenger also consolidates his political authority in the place he has migrated to the extent that with its help he is able to destroy his rejectors and achieve victory for his followers. In the case of Prophet Muhammad, also this second situation arose. So in this situation, we can say that the subject matter of the Quran is a chronicle of his of his warning, which passed through various phases. We have just discussed those phases as Inzar, Inzar-e-Am, Itmam al-Hujjah, and Hijrah. And they culminated in the worldly reward and retribution of his addressees. Now, each of its surahs has been revealed in this background, and each of its chapters have been arranged keeping it in view. So the Quran has been arranged vis-a-vis this subject matter. It is a chronicle of Prophet Muhammad's inzar. It is something that we have to understand, that it encapsulates these phases that we have just discussed. So the initial phases which lead up to the phase of migration, they all occur in the place where the Rasul was initially born, and he was actually delivering that warning to his nation. Once he migrates to the other place, which is the place of migration, of course, then we find that as far as this migrate place is concerned, once again, he on the one hand delivers the truth to the people there, and on the other hand, the Rasul purifies his own lot, his own followers, so that they can be prepared for the final onslaught. And as we have just seen, that this is what actually happened in the case of Prophet Muhammad. So as far as the subject matter of the Quran is concerned, we have to be absolutely clear that this is a book in which the final judgment of God has been preserved regarding Prophet Muhammad's addressees. So to make it even more perhaps distinct for viewers or for you who are listening in, so we can divide the history of mankind into two distinct phases. One is the phase that we can call the prophetic era, which means that this is the phase in which prophets of God, starting from Adam and right up to Prophet Muhammad, they came in succession. And then on Prophet Muhammad, this whole progression ended. And after him, until the day of judgment, we are living in the post-prophetic era. So the feature that I have just described is something that specifically relates to the prophetic era. In the prophetic era, those prophets who are elevated and they become messengers of God, they set up miniature days of judgment against their own people in their own eras, in their own times. And then these people are punished or rewarded. Exactly the same thing which will happen for the rest of mankind on the greater day of judgment. So in these miniature days of judgment, a Rasul actually delivers God's verdict, just as God himself will deliver that verdict for all mankind on the day of judgment. But here, in the case of the prophetic era, in the era of every, or in the time of every messenger of God, in the time of every messenger of God, these miniature days of judgment, they are set up. And the purpose is that these miniature days of judgment can stand proof for people who are living in the post-prophetic era, that their judgment is also going to take place. Their judgment is also going to take place, but it has been deferred to the day of judgment. So as far as people living in the prophetic era is concerned, their judgment is going to take place in this world. It's going to continue in Barzakh, and it's going to still continue on the day of judgment. But people who live in the post-prophetic era, because there is no messenger in that era, so therefore they are not punished in this world necessarily. Yes, at times God does do so, but then for that there's another law. But in this case, generally the account is deferred, settled on the day of judgment. And people of this era, like us, when we read the Quran as a chronicle of Prophet Muhammad's warning, we get to know that this is what happened to nations to whom messengers of God had been assigned. If it is not happening for us, it is only because we don't have a messenger amongst us right at this moment. And this is a practice which ended with Prophet Muhammad's departure. And for us, our reward and punishment has been deferred to the day of judgment. So this is an absolutely important thing that we must understand. Otherwise, we will be guilty of doing certain things which only messengers of God have been allowed to do in their own times, in our own era. So we will be extending some of those practices in our own era. And precisely this is actually what has happened in the case of, for example, people killing people, or people terrorizing people, or people thinking that they can punish people for apostasy, for polytheism, for disbelief in this world, even the post-prophetic era. And that is how we can understand that this thing that we label as Islamic terrorism has arisen by not understanding that there is a certain prerogative mentioned in the Quran only for God's messengers. They have been given a certain authority to settle and punish people in this world and settle their affairs. But this is an authority which cannot be extended in the post-prophetic era. So what has today happened is that what was actually something specific to the prophetic era has been erroneously extrapolated and extended in the post-prophetic era, and the likes of Osama bin Laden or Mullah Omar or Abu Bakr Baghdadi or many other people like them, they think that they also have been authorized to punish people in this world. And that is what they are doing, without realizing that they do not have this authority. This authority ended with God's prophets, rather his messengers. So if we are able to understand this, we can clearly see how the Quran presents itself as a book of warning to the people of its own times, and it presents us with this very important scenario that our own judgment has been deferred to the day of judgment. We have to follow the ways of the Quran. We have to follow what the Quran tells us. If we don't do so, then we are done for. And we have this whole opportunity of our lifetime to reconsider and revisit something that we have been doing in the incorrect way. So if we keep this subject matter of the Quran, which is the chronicle of Prophet Muhammad's inzar, then what exactly is the way to go about understanding the Quran? Firstly, we must deliberate on the contents of every surah. We must come to know the exact phase in which it was revealed, and so much so that we must very accurately go and understand. I mean, we are required to go in this endeavor to the extent that we can very, very satisfactorily say that, for example, a surah has been revealed in the phase of inzar, or in the phase of migration, or in the phase of reward and punishment. All these phases, as we have seen, these are phases of Prophet Muhammad's warning or inzar. So we must know in each phase which surah was revealed, and that is something that can be determined from the very contents of the surah. And that is also something that we have to understand. And if we don't understand that, then what we will be doing, we will be actually doing something in which we are not authorized to do. Secondly, the addressees. So just as we have to determine the exact place or exact time of exact phase of every surah, we must also determine the addressees of each surah, because these addressees, they are different in different surahs, and they could be, for example, the idolaters, they could be the people of the book, they could be the hypocrites, they could be the Prophet himself, peace be upon him, and his followers, or some specific group and denomination from among this main group. It must also be determined if parts of a surah address a secondary addressee besides the primary one. So just as a surah can have a primary addressee, it can also have a secondary addressee. So we must be able to find out that what exactly is the antecedent of every pronoun. We must know that what exactly is the entity which is being referred to by the article alif lam. And we must be able to determine the connotation of every term and expression in the light of the addressees of the surah. This is the second thing. So first, we had to know the phase in which every surah was revealed. Second, we must know who are the addressees of the surah. And thirdly, it must be determined specifically in case of directives which relate to jihad, supremacy of the truth, and political authority. As a result of this supremacy, whether they are a permanent directive of the Sharia, or if they specifically relate to the addressees of the prophetic times. And this is something which is very, very subtle and very important, that especially in case of jihad, in the case of supremacy of the truth, and in the case of political authority, as a result of this supremacy, we must understand whether this is a part of the Sharia or something that was specific to God's messengers. And that is why if we don't understand this, then we will be actually making a wrong judgment. And as I said, in this particular three things have to be, but besides these 3 points that I've just discussed, three punishments must be understood that they can only be given in the prophetic era, and they were given in the prophetic era, and they can no longer be extended in the post-prophetic era. For example, the punishment of shirk, which is polytheism, which was destruction actually, and total annihilation, is something that only God's messenger been given the prerogative to carry out. They did so on God's behalf. This cannot be done by Muslims in the post-prophetic era. Similarly, the punishment of disbelief, of kufr, can only be carried out by God's messengers. And they did. For example, they asked their own people that they should not make friends with people who are enemies of God, and they must not make friends with the Jews and Christians who had become enemies of God in those times. So this is something specific to the prophetic era. Similarly, they cannot wage war against, they can wage war against the Jews and Christians of the times of the Prophet, of course, where they did that, but this cannot be done in the post-prophetic era, because disbelief is something that can only be fully determined in the era of God's messengers. It is something that relates to a lot of things which a person has in his heart or her heart, and this is something which even prophets of God, they do not know. They have to be informed by God's messengers, by God himself through divine revelation. And since there is no divine revelation today, so therefore the door to this punishment also ends. And finally, the punishment of apostasy also is something that relates to the prophetic era, because it means that you accept faith and then you recant. And of course, then the original punishment that is meant for disbelief or shirk will be meted out. But again, this cannot be done in the post-prophetic era. So such is the supreme importance of understanding this whole question is concerned, that the Quran has a very specific background. It addresses people who are directly in front of it. And these people are actually categorized by the Quran as polytheists, hypocrites, or primarily deviant monotheists, like, for example, the Jews and the Christians. But today, the Christians of the Quran, or the Jews of the Quran, or the idolaters of the Quran, they do not exist, because they were ones to whom the Prophet himself delivered the truth, and they were left with no excuse to deny it. Today, no such thing can be done possibly. Of course, for reasons we know, that there is no prophet of God. So today we have to be in a situation in which we can communicate this religion as far as possible without using any force, without in any way undermining them, without in any way making them realize that if they don't accept what we think is the right thing, then they will be doomed in this world by the hands of the believers. And because of the fact that we have not understood this, or rather we can say that a majority of Muslim scholars is on the other side, so they still think that the same punishments which God's messengers were authorized to give, they can give the same punishments today as well, which of course is something of a misreading of the Quran. So finally, we must understand that this aspect of the Quran being a chronicle, a narration of Prophet Muhammad's warning, is so important that if we are not able to understand it, then we will be guilty of extending some of the directives specifically meant for the immediate addressees of God's messengers in this post-prophetic era. Now we come to the eighth. We have just discussed the seventh principle. We'll today also take up the eighth principle, and that actually relates to the fact that Prophet Muhammad is, just as we understand it, it is a book that actually encapsulates the inzar of Prophet's own life. The next principle, which is the eighth principle, is that the Quran is a coherent book. It is not a haphazardly collected book. So our eighth principle is that there is absolutely a coherence found in every surah of the Quran, and the surahs themselves also, which will be discussed later. So within the Quran, each surah is a coherent collection of verses. These verses are not disjointed. They are not disjointed or haphazardly placed. In fact, each surah has a theme, and all the verses are aptly arranged according to this theme. And when a surah is studied while keeping in mind its theme, and when its coherence becomes evident, and as a result of this study, it comes out as a well-knit unit. It comes out to be a well-knit unit. So it is absolutely incorrect to think that coherence or nazm is something of a very subtle nature, or it has no importance regarding the real objective of Islam. It has to be understood that its worth stems from the fact that it is the door through which the real knowledge and wisdom of the Quran can be gauged. A person who reads the Quran without the guidance of coherence, without thinking that the Quran is a coherent book, it's not a collection of verses and in which each verse can be just interpreted out of its context, will not be able to understand the true wisdom and the depth of meaning which the Quran encapsulates. The knowledge of independent and solitary directives, of course, can give us some knowledge, or we can access the wisdom of the Quran in a very partial way. But that holistic understanding of the Quran and the holistic understanding of the directives of God will never be able to be understood the way they have been they have been revealed. So this Quran is a very, very, orderly book. It has furnished historical documents and arguments as well as the ones found in human nature and in the external world in order to substantiate the same premise. So when a person who is aware of this arrangement and he deliberates on a surah, he will feel that he has read a very comprehensive, a very well reasoned, a well argued, a satisfying discourse on whatever topic that has been discussed. So we have to understand that every person that is who knows that this Quran basically is the hablullah, which is the strong rope that Muslims must hold on to, and if we hold on to, then the fabric of the ummah will remain united. And all Muslims have been directed to hold steadfast to this rope and not be divided. So we have seen this by this Quranic verse, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, that hold fast to the rope of God, which is the Quran, and hence not be divided. So an obvious requirement of this directive is that we must turn to the Quran to resolve our differences which arise among us. And it is very unfortunate that all of us have different opinions regarding the Quran. Now there are so many views in the interpretation of every verse, and most of these views are contradictory to one another, that we do not have any clue as to what is the point of reference to decide that which of these views is correct. If a difference of opinion, and you can consult any tafsir and find out that how every verse has been littered with a number of meanings and interpretations. So if a difference of opinion arises in the interpretation of a discourse, the most satisfactory thing which can resolve this is the context and the coherence which is found in the discourse. Verses are not isolatedly mentioned, they are mentioned in a context, in a background. But unfortunately, most people do not regard the Quran to be a coherent book, having a definite context. And the result is that difference of opinion, they become permanent. And a lot of differences of opinion which have arisen in our jurisprudence also are because of disregarding the context of a verse. And even more critical is the issue of juristic differences and, of course, misguided sects. Most of these sects have lent credence to their beliefs through various verses of the Quran. They normally sever a verse from its context and then interpret it the way they want to. So obviously, once a sentence is severed from its context, one can attribute several meanings to it. I mean, just as if you look up a word in the dictionary, it will have so many meanings. But of course, when a word is used in a sentence and a sentence occurs in a paragraph, then you can clearly know that one meaning is implied, not multiple meanings. In a similar way, when you understand a word, you know that it is placed in a verse, and that verse itself is placed in a paragraph, and that paragraph occurs in a surah. So if this holistic approach is followed, we will understand that every Quranic verse has a specific meaning, and it has something that we can clearly understand. And we also know that Ustaz Hamiduddin Farahi had remarked once that Al-Quran la yahtamilu illa ta'wilin wahida, which means that there is only one possibility. There's none but one possibility, that the whole of the Quran has a single meaning. Every verse has a single meaning and not multiple meanings. And this is precisely what we can see from the works of the Farahi scholars. Ustaz Amiruddin Farahi did not get a chance to complete his tafsir. We just have 14 surahs On the other hand, his student Ustaz Amin Islahi was able to complete the complete exegesis of the Quran in 9 volumes, and we can study those 9 volumes and see that he has tried to come up to a single interpretation of each verse, because that is what the Quran actually stands for. And then Ustaz Javed ibn Ghamidi has elaborated further on this work in his Al-Bayan, and shown that we can understand this single meaning right from the meaning of, or the translation of the text of the Quran, and we don't even need to go in the tafsir part, because the meaning itself or the translation itself of surah is so compelling that we can understand that if it is placed in its context, then it cannot have any other meaning. In fact, Ustaz Ghamidi has shown that it is because of this coherence in the Quran that when the Quran called upon its addressees to produce a surah like it, or to emulate it, or produce 10 surahs like it, or produce a Quran like it, it did not ask them to produce independent verses, but actually to produce one or more surahs like it. So we know from the Quran that this again is something that gives rise to the fact that the Quran is something which is a coherent whole. And if this is understood, then we must understand that there are some very important statutes regarding the coherence of the Quran that have been understood and tabulated by Ustaz Ghamidi, and I'm just going to read them out before you. So the first statute in this regard is that each surah has a theme around which its context revolve and make it into a unified whole. It is the most comprehensive statement of its contents, and what the soul is to the body, the theme is to a surah. The first thing is that every surah has a context, has a theme, and that theme is the binding. It's like binds it all the content in a single sentence, which covers and encapsulates the whole surah. The second point that he has mentioned is that together with the main text of a surah, there is an introduction and a conclusion. The content of a surah in some cases can be divided into sections and paragraphs, and in other cases only in paragraphs. Paragraphs depict small shifts in the subject, and sections depict greater shifts in it. The verse of the introduction and of the conclusion, the verses of introduction and conclusion also may at times be divided into paragraphs as per the subject they discuss. Again, something that we have to understand, that the Quran, each surah has a introduction, it has a main body, and it has a conclusion. And this structural arrangement of a surah, if we understand it, it is itself composed of paragraphs, and these paragraphs, they mark smaller shifts, and of course at times in the case of longer surahs, we have sections which have paragraphs. So it's something that we can clearly understand as we go through the text of the surah, that there is an introductory part of the surah, and there is a concluding part, and then there is a main body, and all these three parts, they have paragraphs, and these paragraphs can either be in the case of smaller surahs, they will be just paragraphs, but in the case of larger ones, we will have various sections which will be composed of these paragraphs, just as we have in our own writing systems, that we create a paragraph or create a section which of course marks either a smaller shift or a greater shift. The third thing that Ustaz mentions is that these paragraphs and these sections relate to one another not through a verse-to-verse linear connection, but through various literary devices like parables, comparison or parallelism, as well as through statements and passages which are conditional, parenthetical, inferential, modifying, cyclic, or which signify corollaries, conclusions, questions, or answers. And obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. So, the thing which Ustaz Ghamidi here mentions is that these paragraphs, as they progress, they are not in any way connected in a linear progression, as if we think that every succeeding paragraph is connected to the previous paragraph in a straight line in a linear progression. That is not always the case. But these paragraphs, they are coordinated to the successive paragraphs through various literary devices. For example, one paragraph could raise a question, and that question will be answered in the next paragraph. And now the discourse will then originate from the part where the question was asked, because the answer is something that once given, the discourse will return to the main part. It's not something that's going to progress from the answer, because the answer was given to a question. Similarly, there are verses that present parables, which means that examples of certain incidents in the form of similes. So once that happens, again the discourse will be taken up where that parable began, because that parable is going to get completed at one time, and then once it does, the discourse will come to the original place, and so on and so forth. It's not at this instance my objective to explain all these literary devices, but just to give you an idea. And this is something that we are applying when we are studying the Quran, in the textual study of the Quran, that these paragraphs, they are not connected in a linear way. They are connected either through a cyclic way or through the fact that at times the digression takes place, something is brought up, that digression, which means some part has to be explained, and then once that is done, the discourse moves back to its original, and then it carries on from there. So it would not be correct to connect the discourse to an immediately previous paragraph, because that would be part of a parable, or maybe an explanation, or maybe an answer to a question, or maybe something which is cyclic. So if this is not understood, we might make the mistake of connecting a next paragraph to immediately the previous one, which is not always the case. The fourth thing which Ustaz Ghamidi mentions is that the text of a surah progresses through these paragraphs and sections and gradually reaches its culmination. As a result, the surah assumes a distinct and unique form and shape and becomes a complete and independent whole. So if we look and go through a surah, it is a beautifully arranged, unified whole in which a theme progresses from an introduction to a main body to a conclusion. And in all these sections, we have the Quran conveying its meaning with spectacular magnificence. And at times, if we feel those jolts or maybe gaps, they are not because in any way the discourse itself is disjointed, but because the stylistics of the Quran at times govern this shift. At times there are multiple addressees. So a paragraph would be related to one addressee, for example, the Jews, and the next would be to shift to another group of addressees, which are, of course, in those times standing right in front of the Quran. The Quran will shift from one addressee to the other, and when that shift takes place, of course, the topic will change. And this in no way is any incoherence, because incoherence would be if you're talking to the same addressee and you're bringing up different topics without any relevance. This is not the case. The addressee normally changes, and with that change, the topic changes. Because people don't understand that this change in the addressee changes the topic, they think that there are jolts and hiccups in the Quran, and there are things that are suddenly brought up, and there's things that are suddenly just left as if they had no conclusion. But as I've just said, that if our addressees here, if our viewers here get the chance to read the translation of Ustaz Ghamidi and his annotation, as well as the Tadabbur Quran, they'll find that how these two authors have tried their best to make us understand that there is absolutely no disjointedness, there is no lack of coherence. Things are perfectly connected. The only thing is that normally we are not used to the stylistics of the Quran, in which at times things which are thought to be understood, they are left out. And this device is called hasf. Hasf means suppression. So things that can be understood by the addressee, they are suppressed. Similarly, things that there is a departure in addressees, change in addressees. Similarly, we have the article alif lam, which is the, normally translated as the, but at times it's erroneously translated as the. At times it should be translated as this or that, because there is a antecedent which to this alif lam, which means that it is referring to a particular subset and not to everyone. So these are some literary devices. If we are able to understand, we will never be at loss to understand that, well, why is it that we find the Quran bringing up a topic suddenly and then having another topic which seems to be disconnected from the first. Inshallah, as we go along, the understanding of the Quran that we are carrying out in our analytical study of the Quran and the textual study of the Quran that we are at the moment doing, you'll be able to understand how the coherence of the Quran beautifully unfolds itself. So with this, we come to an end to today's session, and with this small announcement that there will be no class of Saturday class, the usual Saturday class in the month of Ramadan. We will have a daily feature in which the Quran will be discussed. It will be for 30 minutes, 9 p.m. Pakistan Standard Time, in which, like previous Ramazans, we will be discussing a specific verse of the Quran. And of course, there will be a Q&A after that. And these verses have been selected to keep in mind our own self-improvement and life lessons that we can specially understand, learn, and implement in our lives in this holy month of Ramadan. So, if you have any questions regarding what we have started today, please raise them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. So the first question asks, if Qur'an is chronicle of the Prophet, then its compilation should have been in the same order as it was revealed to the Prophet. What is the basis of the coherence and discourse after the order of the completed revelation, like the Wahy was revised?
Right. So that is a very good question, and actually the very question gives the answer as well. That because the Quran was not something that was to be meant for the Sahaba and the Prophet only, it was given a new arrangement. And that arrangement was something that could have become more relevant to people who would come after them. But in order to maintain that chronological sequence as well, there is a very interesting mix in the Quran, and that is that within each chapter of the Quran, so we know that the Quran has 7 chapters, and within each chapter of the Quran, the sequence of the surahs is always historical, is always chronological, which means the surah which is placed first was also revealed first. But that is only within a chapter. So there are 7 chapters. In each chapter, there is a Meccan block with which the chapter begins, and there is a Medinan block on which the chapter ends. And the Meccan and Medinan surahs, they are always in a historical sequence. But overall, this has not been adopted in the Quran because, of course, it was not always something that was meant for only the addressees of the Quran, who were the foremost addressees, but for people like us who were living in the post-prophetic era. So it was given a new arrangement so that it could also become very, very relevant to us. So in toto, we can say that in one sense, the Quran has preserved that chronological sequence, but that is within the chapter. But then the way these 7 chapters have been arranged, that is something for us to understand, so that as addressees in the post-prophetic era, we can also make ourselves relevant to the Quran.
Thank you.
Or rather, it's the reverse. The Quran is more relevant to us.
Salman Aziz, please go ahead.
Sir, if the other punishments for fasad in the earth, like rustification, etc., are still valid, then why not the punishment of apostasy or disbelief could be carried out as for the time of the Prophet in days of today?
I mean, I've just tried to explain this, that apostasy or disbelief or polytheism, these are punishments which only God has chosen to keep to himself. He delivered these punishments through his messengers in the prophetic era. Because for those punishments, it is essential that we know what is in the hearts of people. If they are denying, is it out of any confusion, out of any misconception, out of lack of information? This is something that can happen today. We could be confused, we could be led away by the actions of the Muslims, we could be not in a position at times, for example, people living far off, to not have actually the message not having reached them. But these pretexts, they are absolutely, done for in the prophetic era, because there is no chance of any confusion. There is no chance that the message would not have reached anyone. There is no chance that people are thinking otherwise. So a messenger delivers the truth in such an ultimate way that the consequence of that becomes evident, and that is that if that is not accepted, then people shall be punished, and if it is accepted, then they are rewarded. Precisely the same pretext that is available on the day of judgment. So God is going to reward and punish people on the day of judgment, and he does so in the prophetic era because he is someone who has selected these messengers. He gives those messengers the charge and the authority, and of course a lot of miracles, similarly a lot of eloquence in which the message is delivered to such an extent that they cannot deny it in any way. But in the post-prophetic era, we don't have this feature. We can in no way have this feature. The punishment of fasad fil ard is something totally different. It relates to creating disorder in the land by creating a law and order situation. For example, people who are rapists or child molesters or who hijack people for ransom, etc. So these are some punishments reserved for them. So the fasad fil ard is an entirely different category. But the category of polytheism, the category of disbelief, and the category of apostasy, these are punishments that can only be given if the truth is conveyed to the addressees in its ultimate form. This cannot be done in the, this cannot be ensured in the post-prophetic era, because for such a delivery, messenger of God is needed, which we don't have in this era.
So this is another question following up to the first question that we received, and it's about, again, the organization of the Qur'an. So they ask, is Surah Fatiha then the first surah revealed to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam?
Yes, indeed, it is.
Okay, thank you. Shaban Ansari, please go ahead.
अस्सलाम वालेकुम।
वालेकुम अस्सलाम।
कुरान में जैसे है कि अफराद का हिसाब किताब की क़यामत मतलब होगी आखिरत में, तो कौमों की का हिसाब किताब जो है वो दुनिया में ही हो जाता है कि उनके अखलाकी ज़वाल और उनका दुनियावी तौर पे पीछे रह जाने की वजह से उनकी आखिरत दुनिया में ही हो जाती है कि आखिरत में ही होगी?
So for the nations, for collective groups of people who we call nations, for them, yes, their own accountability takes place in this world. But the way this accountability takes place for nations is twofold. One, that they are destroyed in this world because they are addressees of God's messenger. So this is one way in which this accountability takes place, and this normally takes place in the prophetic era. In the post-prophetic era, what happens is that the rise and fall of nations is governed by moral principles, and God says that He has chosen people from His knowledge and given them this supremacy in various eras, and until the day of judgment this will continue. For example, we know that He gave this supremacy to the Hamites first, and then to the Semites, and now to the Japhites. So the three sons of Prophet Noah, each of the progeny of these sons were given this supremacy, and then they disappeared from the face of the earth, and a new nation appeared. And if you look at history, so these are the three main nations, or a greater divide, we can say, and within them, of course, we have lesser divides as well. But broadly, every single nation is given the chance to face this supremacy, or to encounter this supremacy and then die away. But this is not something that is done in a visible way, in which there are disasters or maybe earthquakes or cyclones, or there is a war between believers and disbelievers, as is the case in the prophetic era. This is done by God Himself, by creating various circumstances in which those nations are given a chance, and if they don't follow suit, for example, in upholding moral principles, then they themselves die, they face decadence, and they just fade away. So that is like a cycle that goes on, and the visual of that cycle is not that there's going to be destruction either through cyclones or, for example, earthquakes or natural calamities, as was the case in the prophetic era, or like a war that is going to take place between the believers and disbelievers, which is also specific to the prophetic era. So normally in the post-prophetic era, this rise and fall of nation goes through its own pattern. So in total, what we can say is that these are the two ways in which nations' fates are decided. One is a symbolism of the prophetic era, in which you can visibly see these destructions and how nations come and go. But in the post-prophetic era, it is rather subtle. It takes place on a very longer period of time. In the prophetic era, it takes place within the lifetime of a messenger. But in the post-prophetic era, it's like a gradual change that occurs. And this is how it has been. And actually, this has been documented in the Qur'an as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question asks, if Qur'an was adopted for the future addressees to come till the day of judgment, then why is the language of Qur'an limited to classical Arabic, and it's more relevant to the Arabic at the time of the prophetic era? Why was the language of Qur'an not adjusted for the future generations?
This is because it would have become impossible, because for future generations, the diction of Arabic has continued to change in the last 14 centuries. For this, every time a new Quran would have to be revealed, because the diction, if it was not held to be constant, one single diction of any era, then the same question would have arisen, because that diction would have changed again after 100 years, maybe, or 200 years. So one particular diction had to be adopted, and for that, the best would have been the one in which it was revealed. So the only question is that people who become scholars of the Quran should be well versed with that diction. Otherwise, it would have become impossible. The only way out would have been to reveal a Quran every time a new diction of a language would have been created. So that would go on and on. It would be an infinitesimal process. So I think that, or infinite process rather. So that was the only humanly understandable way that discourse be revealed in a specific language of a specific time, and then people should be asked that they must be well versed with that language in order to understand the Quran. And for that, Arabic language itself was preserved. We know how classical language still exists, and it's just a question of becoming scholars of that language.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Suman Aziz, please go ahead.
So one of the objection on the research of Ghamidi Saab and his uh, scholar teachers is that even the people who has the knowledge of Arabic, whose native language was Arabic, didn't come up with the idea of coherence. So how the people who are from the subcontinent coming up with this idea? Could
This
you
is
please,
because people who are native speakers of Arabic, they are not native speakers of the Quran, Quranic Arabic. I mean, they don't speak the same Arabic as the Quran. So you see, what has happened is that very earlier on in the history of our Ummah, the text of the Quran, which, if deliberated upon, could have given us this conclusion, was left to be just either learned by heart or to be read as a book that could just, give some soothing to the dear departed. It never was a text after the first couple of centuries that was deliberated upon as a text that could directly be understood, and of course, if as a result of that, something that was a secret of that text or something that was the majesty of that text could have been revealed. So very earlier on, the departure that took place was that instead of understanding the text from the language of the Quran itself, or the coherence or the context, the stress was that we can only understand the Quran through Hadith literature or history. So the Quran itself never became a text that was deliberated upon by scholars of the Quran. Very earlier on, very earlier on, I think maybe in the times of the third or second generation even, the whole impetus shifted towards understanding the Quran through Hadith literature. And that is how, this departure has taken place. So one of the greatest contributions of Ustaz Meezan Farahi is that he has redirected our lost fleet to its original course, that it is the Quran that has to be deliberated upon. It is the Quran that must be the instrument of understanding, not through Hadith but directly. In fact, Hadith needs the Quran for understanding. The Quran does not need the Hadith for understanding. So this is such a major, I would say, departure that took place earlier on in our history, that it's still going on. It's just a few people like Farahi Saab or Islahi Saab or Ghamidi Saab who have tried to change the course, but 99.9% of the Ummah is still chalking out the same course, in which the Quran is still understood not from the text itself or its coherence or its context, but through an extraneous source. And till the time this is going to keep happening, we cannot find any way out to this big problem that you referred to.
so don't people say that Shan and Nazul and the introduction is same things?
Introduction to what?
The introduction of a surah and Shan and Nazul are one and the same thing.
No, they are two entirely different things. You see, from what Shan Nuzul means, that you understand a surah from an extraneous source, which is the hadith, historical incident, which will come, and most of these Shan Nuzul hadiths are found in our tafsir books, and you can study them, and you'll see that a very major part of them are not authentic. It's not authentically reported, and these are not even ahadith. Many of them are asar, and still many of them are actually the statements of the tabi'un, the third generation people. So that's not correct at all. The introduction of a surah has to be understood from the surah itself, because that is something that we can rely upon. When we start understanding a surah from the Shan Nuzul, that Shan Nuzul is an extraneous thing. That is a hadith actually. And then, because I have been going through this a lot, I can tell you out of my own experience that these Shan Nuzul hadiths, they have a very, very little to do with the text of the Quran. and in many cases they have in fact been not properly reported. So that is why we just cannot depend. In fact, even consulting these Shan Nuzul ahadith is going to make matters more difficult in understanding the Quran, because they have an entirely different story to tell. And this, maybe you can, as a student of the Quran, whenever you have time, you can pick up, for example, the tafsir of Ibn Kasir, because that is one tafsir that has been translated into Urdu and into English as well. I would have referred you to Tabari, but Tabari as yet has not been translated. It is the first source. So, but if you pick up, for example, Ibn Kasir and some of the other ancillary works, you will find out, you can read for your own self in the Urdu or English languages how they take up a certain Shan Nuzul, and then they say that this is the background of the surah or the background of this verse, and the context of this verse will itself, on many occasions, just not accept this Shan Nuzul. And let me also give you an example for this that you can, maybe whenever you have the time, you can go and read. So this verse of Surah Hujurat, which says, Ya ayyuhal lazina amanu, in ja'akum fasikum binaba'in fatabayyinu. This is a very famous surah, a very famous verse of Surah Hujurat. I think it's the 5th or 6th verse, which tells us that if someone comes to you with a news, then you must investigate it. Now there is a Shan Nuzul associated with this verse that has been reported in our tafsir books. Just read that Shan Nuzul and then pick up Ustaz Amin Islahi's commentary to the Quran in Surah Hujurat, and then read through that criticism on that Shan Nuzul. That is just one example that will make you understand that how these Shan Nuzul ahadith are so different, and the Quran itself does not accept them.
Thank you very much.
But doesn't these Shan Nuzul make us easy to understand typical surah or its context? For example, in the Surah Falak, they're talking about the sorcerers which cast spells by doing magic on the knots. So there is
that's what I'm saying. If you look at that, if you look at the Shan Nuzul of Surah Falak and Surah Nas, you'll see that no such thing happened. But the Quran itself tells us that the Jews.
So there was no magic on the Prophet, sir? You were saying that?
Yes, I'm saying that they did try to weave a spell of magic on the Prophet, but they never succeeded. But if you look at the Shan Nuzul, you'll see that the Prophet actually, for 6 months or even more, he did not know whether he had received something, whether he had prayed or not prayed, whether he had gone to a wife or not wife, one wife or to another. So for 6 or 7 months, he did not have that sense. And if that is accepted, then we clearly can see that in those 6 and 7 months in which perhaps he was under a magical spell, how could he have known whether there was a wahi at hand, and he would have forgotten it? So this is what is a story that we are told by the Shan Nuzul ahadith. But the Quran itself does not accept them. And as I said, if you would like, you can read it from Surah Hujurat, the example that I gave, and you can also read Surah Falak and Surah Nas from the Quran, because this very Shan Nuzul has been discussed in those surahs as well, and he has shown how it is untenable.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. We have 2 more questions. Would you have time for those?
Yes, please go ahead. Go ahead.
At what point of time in Prophet's life was the order of the Quran revised, and who did it?
So we know this from Surah Qiyamah, that this is something that took place near the end of Prophet's life, and if you read verses 16 to 19 of Surah Qiyamah, which is the 75th surah, it actually portrays that like a future happening that will take place, and that is the Quran will be given a new arrangement. And if you look at historically, then you'll find that this actually took place in the last Ramadan of his life, and after that he remained alive for 5 or 6 more months. But this happened in the last Ramadan, when there was a what you can say, a revision of the Quran by Gabriel and between Gabriel and the Prophet, in which the two actually read out to each other the final arrangement. And then once this has happened, then in the last 4 or 5 months, this new arrangement was communicated to the Sahaba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem. Shaban Ansari, please go ahead.
ये मौलाना फराही और मौलाना इस्लाही और गामदी साहब का बहुत बड़ा एहसान है हम पर और मुसलमानों पर और उम्मत पर कि उन्होंने इस किताब को इन्ना कौमी तखज़ु हाज़ल कुरान महजूरा बनने से बचाया है। वरना ये कि ये हाल है कि मैं देखती थी जहाँ भी अगर मैं जाती थी तो दरसे हदीस हो रहा होता था, तो मैं सोचती थी कि ये बड़े-बड़े उलमा जो हैं ये कुरान क्यों नहीं पढ़ाते हैं, दरसे हदीस ही क्यों होता है सिर्फ। तो वो बात समझ आई कि वो कुरान तो समझ आने की चीज़ ही नहीं है, कुरान की तो वो अहमियत ही नहीं थी। तो अल्हम्दुलिल्लाह कि कुरान की ये अहमियत हो गई है, अल्लाह का शुक्र है। और मदीना में और मक्का में जब अभी भी जाएँ, तो वहाँ पर अभी भी ये हाल है कि वहाँ मतलब छोटे-छोटे हल्के बने होते हैं, लेकिन फ़ोकस सारा बस याद करने पर होता है, कुरान का समझने-समझाने पे नहीं होता। जो छोटे-छोटे ग्रुप बने हुए होते हैं वहाँ मदीना में, मस्जिदों में और
It's the same, I think, in most places, not even just limited to Medina and Mecca.
नहीं
School.
हाँ, वो तो ठीक है। मैं तो वहाँ तो ये सोच के गई थी ना कि ये तो वो जगह है जहाँ पर कुरान नाज़िल हुआ है, तो यहाँ कुरान को समझने-समझाने पे ज़ोर होगा। तो वहाँ पर भी मदीना में और मक्का में वहाँ पर भी बस कुरान याद करने पर ज़ोर होता है, उसको समझने की बात नहीं हो रही होती। तो और
Correct.
यहाँ पर भी उलमा जो है वो दरसे हदीस देते थे, तो मुझे हैरत होती थी कि कुरान क्यों नहीं दरसे कुरान क्यों नहीं हो रहा? तो दरसे हदीस फिर ये समझ आई कि अच्छा जी कुरान तो समझ ही नहीं आ सकता, वो तो हदीस से ही समझा जाएगा। तो अब जाके शुक्र है कि ये बात समझ आई कि अल्लाह ताला की इतनी अजीम किताब, अल्लाह ताला के अल्फाज ऐसे तो नहीं हो सकते ना।
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much for sharing your
Thank
comments. And thank you, Dr. Saleem, for another wonderful session. And thanks to all the participants for coming through. Inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow in another session of textual study of the Qur'an before the Ramadan. And with that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.